to dive into some ancient history.
Absolutely. Always up for a good deep dive.
Today, we're tackling a pivotal moment for the Israelites, the transition from the era of judges to the reign of their first king.
Oh, yeah, that's a period packed with drama, intrigue, and some serious theological questions. We're talking about human desire clashing with divine will.
And all of it's playing out in the book of 1 Samuel, right?
That's our main source for this deep dive, yep. And let me tell you, it's way more than just a simple story. We're going to see how choices made during this time had consequences that echoed through generations.
Makes you think about the weight of our own decisions, doesn't it?
It really does. One of the most fascinating things about this whole transition is that it reveals a deeper internal conflict within the Israelites.
What do you mean by that?
Well, their desire for a king wasn't just about politics or wanting to be like their neighbors. It was a symptom of their struggle with faith and obedience to God.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? I mean, these were the people who'd seen the Red Sea part, manna fall from the sky. You'd think they'd be all in on trusting God's leadership.
You'd think so, right? But even with those incredible experiences, they still felt this need for a visible human king. Almost like they were saying, God, we love you, but we want someone we can see in charge.
That tension between trusting God's unseen hand and wanting a human leader is a thread that runs through the whole story, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a struggle that we still grapple with today, honestly.
Before we get into all the drama with King Saul, we need to lay the groundwork with Samuel, right? He was the bridge between these two eras.
Can't forget Samuel. He was the last judge, a prophet, priest, a pivotal figure. His story sets the stage for everything that follows.
Even his birth was pretty remarkable. His mom, Hannah, poured out her heart to God, desperate for a child.
Then her prayer was answered. But then we see Samuel growing up in the very temple where Eli's sons are. Well, let's just say they weren't exactly winning any Priest of the Year awards.
Definitely not role model material.
The contrast between Samuel's piety and the corruption of Eli's sons is striking. It shows how personal choices, even within a sacred space, can have massive consequences.
Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, they basically abused their positions, right? Didn't they face some serious repercussions for that?
Oh yeah, major consequences. They died in battle, and then there was the capture of the Ark of the Covenant by the Philistines.
Losing the Ark. That must have been a devastating blow for the Israelites. It wasn't just some object, was it?
Not at all. It symbolized God's presence among them. Think of it as the cornerstone of their faith. Its capture represented a rupture in their relationship with God, a consequence of straying from his commands.
But wait, didn't something happen to the Philistines after they captured the Ark?
Now, this is interesting. According to the biblical account, they started experiencing plagues and calamities.
Really? So even the Philistines, who didn't believe in the power of the Ark, still suffered from having it.
Exactly. It's as if the Ark itself, as a vessel of God's holiness, couldn't be possessed without consequences.
Okay, that's pretty mind-blowing. So Samuel, he must have been instrumental in getting the Ark back, right?
He was a key figure in guiding the Israelites back to God. He called for repentance, urging them to turn away from their idols and seek God's forgiveness.
And then they managed to defeat the Philistines. It was a national reset, right? Showing that aligning with God brings blessings.
Absolutely. But then,
Yeah.
well, then comes the head scratcher. Even after experiencing this incredible victory and having Samuel as their leader, the Israelites do something that baffles him.
They demand a king.
Yep. They looked at the surrounding nations with their fancy kings, armies, and palaces and thought, that's what we need. But they were basically rejecting God as their true king.
Talk about wanting what you think will make you happy.
Isn't that the truth? And their demand really grieved Samuel. He knew it was a rejection of God's direct leadership.
So what happens? Does God tell Samuel to just say no to them?
He does tell Samuel to honor their request, but he also warns the Israelites about the potential downsides of having a king, taxes, forced military service, the possibility of abuse of power.
Talk about foreshadowing. So who is this first king? Tell me about Saul. How does he come into the picture?
Well, God chooses Saul, but here's the twist. He wasn't chosen for his piety or wisdom, but for his impressive physical stature. He was literally head and shoulders above everyone else.
God working in mysterious ways, huh?
Right. And at first, Saul seems like the perfect choice. He unites the tribes, wins battles, gets that public acclaim as king. He's got the looks, the charisma, the military skill.
I'm sensing a but coming.
But then we start to see cracks in his obedience to God.
What kind of cracks? Give me an example.
Well, there's the incident where he offers sacrifices before Samuel arrives. He's impatient, wants to do things his own way. Then there's the time he fails to completely destroy the Amalekites as God commanded. He keeps some of the spoils of war for himself.
So he's putting his own desires ahead of God's clear instructions.
Exactly. And these seemingly small acts have major consequences. The Spirit of the Lord departs from Saul, and he's tormented by what the Bible describes as an evil spirit. It leads to anxiety, paranoia, erratic behavior.
Hold on. Was it literally an evil spirit, or is that a metaphor for the psychological turmoil of being out of sync with God?
It's a question that's generated a lot of debate. Some interpret it literally as a demonic presence. Others see it as a powerful metaphor for the inner turmoil that comes from rejecting God's will.
So whether literal or metaphorical, it definitely impacted Saul big time.
Oh, absolutely. He becomes a shadow of his former self, consumed by fear and suspicion. And it makes you wonder, if he had remained faithful, how different would his reign have been?
It's the big what if that hangs over his story.
As Saul's reign is crumbling, God's plan is already in motion. He's preparing someone else to lead, someone who will lead with a heart after God's own heart.
Which brings us to David.
Enter David.
The shepherd boy, the giant slayer, the future king.
He's the one. But let's not jump ahead too quickly. The significance of David's anointing happens while Saul is still king, right?
Right. So God's already setting the stage for the next chapter, even as the current one is falling apart.
It's like God saying, don't worry, I've got this. My plan will unfold, even when it looks messy.
Let's talk about David and Goliath. I mean, come on, that's the ultimate underdog story.
It's not just a great story, though. It's a powerful symbol of faith and obedience.
Break it down for me. What makes this encounter so significant?
You have David, armed with just his faith and a slingshot, facing Goliath, this towering warrior in full armor. It's a stark contrast, highlighting the difference between human strength and reliance on God. David's victory isn't just military, it's a spiritual victory.
And the way David approaches the fight is fascinating, too.
Oh, yeah. He doesn't try to fight Goliath on the giant's terms. No heavy armor, no sword. He sticks with what he knows, a slingshot and stones. Skills honed from years of protecting his sheep. And he goes into that fight declaring that the battle belongs to the Lord.
So it's not blind faith. He's combining faith with his skills and experience.
Exactly. And then there's a detail about him targeting Goliath's forehead. He's not going for brute force. He's aiming for precision, trusting that God will guide his aim.
It's like he's saying, God, I'm doing my part, but ultimately victory is in your hands.
And that victory throws David into the spotlight right at the same time that Saul is struggling.
Talk about a recipe for tension.
And that's where we'll pick up next time. We'll explore Saul's descent into jealousy and paranoia and how David manages to navigate this incredibly dangerous situation. Welcome back. Ready for more of this ancient drama?
Absolutely. Last time we left King Saul spiraling, right? Consumed by jealousy towards David. What happens next? Does he just accept that David's the future king?
Not quite. Saul's story actually takes a pretty heartbreaking turn. He gets so overwhelmed by fear and desperation that he ends up making a decision that goes against God's law.
Okay, now I'm really curious. What did he do?
Remember how Samuel had passed away? Well, Saul decides to consult a medium, someone who claims to communicate with the dead.
He wants to talk to Samuel.
Yeah. He's looking for answers, guidance, maybe even a loophole to change his fate. But this act of necromancy goes directly against God's commands.
Talk about a desperate move. I guess when you're facing the potential loss of everything, you might grasp at anything, huh?
I think it really shows how deeply insecure Saul had become. He couldn't face the consequences of his own choices.
Oh, does he actually get to talk to Samuel?
According to the biblical account, yes. And even in death, Samuel doesn't sugarcoat things. He basically confirms that Saul's reign is over, that God has chosen David as the next king.
That's got to sting. Like the universe itself is confirming his worst fears.
It is. And from that point on, Saul's decline accelerates.
Where does this downward spiral lead him?
It culminates in a tragic end on the battlefield. A final, decisive battle with the Philistines.
The same Philistines who captured the ark all those years ago.
The very same. And in this battle, Saul is facing devastating losses. His army's defeated, his sons are killed in action. It's a scene of complete chaos and despair.
Wow. I can't even imagine the weight of that grief and the feeling of utter defeat. So what does Saul do? Does he try to rally his remaining troops? Surrender.
He makes a different choice, one born out of despair. Facing total defeat, he decides to take his own life rather than be captured by the Philistines.
It's a dark end to what started with so much promise.
It really underscores the consequences of his choices, that downward spiral that started with those seemingly small acts of disobedience. It reminds us that even those chosen by God aren't immune to the repercussions of their actions.
But amidst all this tragedy, we have David waiting in the wings.
Right, and his story really serves as a counterpoint to Saul's, a testament to faithfulness and obedience. Even as Saul is falling apart, David's star is rising.
I can't imagine how difficult it must have been for David, all those years running from Saul, never knowing who to trust. Those experiences could make anyone cynical.
It's a testament to his faith that he emerged from that ordeal even stronger. He relied on God's guidance and protection, never losing sight of his ultimate purpose.
And then there's that period where he actually lives among the Philistines, right? The very people he was fighting against.
It's a complex chapter in his story. Some see it as a strategic move, a way to gather intel on his enemies. Others view it as a time of compromise, where his survival instincts might have overshadowed his commitment to God and his people.
It just shows that even the most faithful individuals are still human, facing real dilemmas, making tough choices.
Exactly, and that complexity makes his story even more compelling. It allows us to connect with him on a deeper level.
So now we have Saul gone, David having survived all these trials, the promise of a new era for Israel under his leadership.
But as we've seen, transitions of power are rarely simple, especially in the ancient world.
What happens next? How does David actually take the throne, and what challenges await him as the new king?
Buckle up, because things are about to get even more interesting. There are rival claims to the throne, political maneuvering, those ongoing conflicts with the Philistines. David's going to have to navigate all of that.
I can't wait to hear how it all unfolds. Welcome back, everyone. It's the final chapter of our deep dive into Israel's move from judges to kings. We followed Saul's journey, seen David rise up. Now it's time for the dynasty to begin, right?
Well, it's not quite as straightforward as you might think. Passing the crown wasn't just a simple handoff. There are power struggles, rivalries, even questions about whether David really has the right to be king.
Right. Last time we left off with Saul gone and David chosen, but not exactly a clear path to the throne. What made things so complicated?
Remember, Israel wasn't a single unified country like we think of it today. It was more like a bunch of tribes, each with their own leaders and agendas. So while David was proclaimed king in Hebron by the tribe of Judah, Saul's son Ishbosheth was set up as a rival king by Abner, the commander of Saul's army.
Two kings. Whoa. Talk about a recipe for conflict.
Exactly, and that's exactly what happens. It's a period marked by political maneuvering and, yeah, unfortunately some bloodshed too. Transitions of power were rarely peaceful, even back then.
So how does David eventually come out on top? Did he just have a stronger army, or was there more to it?
There were military battles, for sure, and some strategic alliances formed. But ultimately, David's rise was less about brute force and more about God's favor and his own character. Don't forget, he was anointed by Samuel years earlier. Plus, he showed a lot of restraint and wisdom, refusing to grab power through violence or deceit.
He earned it, didn't he?
He did. But even once he became king of a united Israel, his challenges weren't over. Not by a long shot.
What kind of problems did he face once he had the crown?
First off, there were the Philistines. They were still a major threat. They weren't going to just sit back and watch as Israel got stronger under David. He had to prove himself as a military leader, and he did, winning key victories that really solidified his position.
I can picture those battles now. David, leading his armies to victory. It's no wonder he became such a legendary figure.
Oh, absolutely. But it wasn't just external enemies. His personal life, as the Bible tells it, was filled with drama and tragedy too. Rebellions, betrayals, even family tragedies that really tested his strength and faith.
It sounds almost Shakespearean. Can you give me an example? What was one of the biggest internal challenges he had to deal with?
One of the most famous and heartbreaking is the rebellion led by his son Absalom. This wasn't just some minor squabble either. Absalom managed to rally a lot of people to his side and actually tried to take the throne from his own father. David had to flee Jerusalem and fight to get his kingdom back.
Betrayed by your own son. That's brutal. How did he ever cope with that?
It really shows David's strength of character, that he didn't let that experience turn him bitter. He grieved the loss of his son, even as he fought to reclaim his kingship.
So even with all the political turmoil and personal heartbreak, he kept his compassion.
He did. And through it all, he never lost sight of God. He made mistakes, some big ones, but he was always ready to admit them, to seek forgiveness, and to try to live in accordance with God's will.
He's human, right? Not some perfect hero.
Exactly. And that's part of what makes his story so powerful, so relevant even today. He messed up, faced the consequences, sought forgiveness, and ultimately tried to live a life that honored God.
Sounds like this transition from judges to kings was way more than just a political shift. It was a huge spiritual journey for all of Israel.
It really was. It's a story about a nation grappling with their faith, their identity, their relationship with God. They were looking for security, for a leader who could represent their hopes. And in David, they found someone who, despite his imperfections, ultimately pointed them back to God.
This whole deep dive has been amazing. It really makes you think about how our choices, whether they seem big or small, have an impact far beyond ourselves.
And it reminds us that even the most powerful leaders are human, capable of doing both great things and terrible things.
It's been a journey, that's for sure.
It has. So as we think about Samuel, Saul, and David, I think we should all ask ourselves, what choices are we making today that will shape our own legacy? What can we learn from their successes and failures? How can we cultivate the same faith, humility, and integrity that helped David lead his people?
Those are some great questions to ponder. We'll leave you with those thoughts. Thanks for joining us on this incredible deep dives into ancient history. So until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep exploring.